So thank you for bearing with on all of that. Welcome our first speaker for this afternoon. We have three wonderful speakers this afternoon. We have Professor Burton, who is going to talk to us on Marcher monasteries and their landscapes with a special reference to the South March. Thank you, Janet.
Well, thank you, Pam. Good afternoon, everyone. Prynawn da. Thank you very much to the Society for asking me to speak this afternoon. I don't know if the people in the front row can see me because I'm actually quite small, but I am here. Okay, right. Well, we've started with the dodgy. Whoops. Oh, the laptop. Do you want me to do it from there? That's the first one. Yes, I hope you're not going to be bobbing up and down the stairs. Otherwise it will get your steps up for the day. Okay, so in my paper this afternoon, I'm going to consider three themes which you see here on the screen. First, I'd like to talk about the sites chosen for monastic houses, founded in the March from the last decades of the 11th century onwards. That is, their immediate location in the landscape. Now, the establishment of a monastic presence, be it an independent abbey, a dependent priory or a cell, was the product of negotiation among different parties, certainly between a potential founder and a monastic order or an existing house from which monks or canons were to be drawn. It might further involve a bishop or a secular ruler, and this could be a long, drawn-out process. Monastic foundation was a process, not an event. But all these parties had the potential to influence the choice of location within the landscape. The sites selected were not random, but informed by multiple factors, some of them overlapping, and the first part of this paper seeks to explore something of their diversity. Now, the second and third themes are really linked. I'll move on to think about the physical and visual impact of these monasteries within their immediate environment. And finally, I'll think about ways in which, once established, monasteries might, through their economic activities, be agents of transformation of their landscapes. Now, these are big topics, so I'm going to illustrate them mainly by reference to the Southern Welsh March. First, however, it might be worthwhile, just by way of introduction, to try to define which monasteries I'm talking about. March monasteries, well, much depends on our chronological standpoint. After the Edwardian conquest, the political geography of Wales was defined as the Principality of Wales and a number of Marcher baronies. And we'll just try again here. Yes, right. And this is, as be familiar to many of you, it's the map taken from the Mortimer website. So we've got the Principality here in purple and the Marcher lordships in grey. But before that, it might be easier to think of the March less as a legal entity and more as a permeable border defined by fluctuating political dominance. Some monasteries began their lives as native Welsh foundations and became Marcher houses. Conversely, others began as Marcher foundations and became Welsh. Cistercian Whitland, for instance, was founded by Bishop Bernard of St. David's in an area that was at the time under Marcher control. Through political change, the area came under Welsh rule, and Whitland became not just a Welsh house, but the ultimate mother house of all the Cistercian foundations in Pura Walia. In contrast, other Cistercian houses started life as native Welsh foundations, but passed into the patronage of Marcher lordships. And the permeability of the border is well illustrated by one such native abbey, Cumhir, which at times, even before the late 13th century, was under the control of the Mortimer family of the March. So our, or perhaps rather my definition of Marcher monasteries has to be flexible. And I've just attempted to illustrate some of the dynamics on these next two slides. Now, this first slide shows the distribution of monastic houses by order, and these are color-coded. The blue represents foundations made by the Normans in areas conquered from the Welsh. The black are selected English foundations on the English side of the March, principally ones that I might be referring to. These are selective. But those in red are the ones I've just mentioned. They're the Cistercian houses that start out as Welsh and then come under patronage of the Marcher lords. Now, here we've got these same foundations rearranged by date of foundation. I should have added that in that first slide, perhaps I'll just put it back because something I did forget to say, we might notice the dominance of foundations in areas conquered from by the Normans from the Welsh, and also that the majority of them are Benedictine houses. Now, here we see the same foundations arranged by date of foundation in 30-year periods. And again, I'd just like to note that preponderance of early foundations in the southern Welsh March, a number between 1070 and 1100, but a large number between about 1100 and 1130. So the South Welsh March seems to be the region of expansion and the dominance of Benedictine foundations. So that's by way of introduction. So I'll turn now to my first theme, location of monasteries within the landscape. And there are three main points that I'd like to illustrate. First, that a number of foundations were associated with early medieval sites. Some were associated with castles, and others by lines of communication. And of course, there is some overlap among these three themes. So let's think, first of all, about the evidence that monasteries were associated with early medieval sites. And I am going to be concentrating in the first part of this section on the Benedictine and Cluniac houses of the southern March. And here they are. Now, I do apologize for the poor quality of this slide. It's a great map. It's one that Martin Crampin prepared for Karen Stöber and I for abbeys and priories of medieval Wales. It's just my reproduction of it that is pretty poor. I'm afraid I had to scan it in from the book, so it's not quite as I would have liked. But I hope you can see the point here. And these are the Benedictine and Cluniac houses spread across that southern part of Wales. And I'll just look at a few of them in order to demonstrate the significance, first of all, of church dedications. So we start out here at Basileg, there, just to the west of Newport. Now, it was here that a cell of Glastonbury Abbey was founded by Robert de Hay, likely in the last decade of the 11th century. And Robert was also very probably the founder of the nearby priory of Malpas, which was a Cluniac house. Now, Basileg was the only medieval monastic dedication to St. Basil recorded in either England or Wales. So it is unique in this sense. Basil was not a Welsh saint, of course, but the dedication was that of a pre-conquest class church that controlled much of the land between the rivers Rhymney and Ebw. Now, Robert's grant to Glastonbury included the church of Basileg and its dependent churches and chapels. And this doubtless reflects the early medieval ecclesiastical arrangement. Now, this is an important point, Because I think what we're seeing here is the repurposing of an existing church. That's the dynamic behind this particular foundation at this particular spot in the landscape. So let's look at another one here, Llangia, just there. Llangia lying north of Abergavenny and on the Welsh side of the River Monnow. So here we see on the left the small priory church of Llangia, which was dedicated to the native saint Cia. This again suggests the repurposing of an existing church. Its founder, whose name, identity we don't even know, granted Llangia to the Abbey of Lyr in Normandy as a small cell. And by cell, I mean a small community of maybe just 2 or 3 monks placed there to administer estates of a larger abbey. But whoever the founder was, he or she retained the native dedication, but added a second dedication to a universal saint, St. James. Another example is furnished by the place that you see on the right, Llangennydd, dedicated to the native Saint Kenneth. Now, Llangennydd was granted to another Norman monastery, Evreux, by Henry de Beaumont, Earl of Warwick and Lord of Gower under Henry I. Now, this was sometime before 1115. But it may have been sometime before the establishment of a small monastic presence here. There were probably never more than the 2 or 3 monks that are first documented at Llangennydd in 1218. And the dedication of the short-lived house at Llandovery is not recorded as such, but the Llan element of the name may again suggest the grant of an existing church, this time not to a Norman monastery, but to an English one at Malvern. And we have other double dedications that suggest an early medieval pre-conquest presence. And we've got another one here, St. Clair's, a small Cluniac priory, a daughter house of Saint-Martin-des-Champs in Paris. Now, this is dedicated to St. Mary Magdalene and the Welsh St. Claris. So it's another double dedication here where we get an early medieval saint, an early medieval dedication, and a more universal one added on. We've got St. John and St. Tylwyddog at Augustinian Carmarthen, and on the English side of the march, we might move north to think about a place that's already been mentioned today, St. Michael and St. Milburger, the Cluniac house of Much Wenlock, founded in, or refounded rather, round about 1080. Now, in all these cases, dedications suggest that the location of the monastic foundation made by a Norman incomer was dictated by the presence of an existing church, which often with its lands and endowments passed to the new establishment. Choosing these particular spots on which to locate a monastic house within the landscape seems to have been driven by the desire for continuity of places of religious observance from the early medieval through into the Norman period. That they were mostly Benedictine and, moreover, dependent priories or cells reflects the ways in which incoming founders chose to endow English or continental houses with the Welsh endowments of religious communities, now replaced by something the founders perhaps perceived as more modern, or perhaps you might better say, to represent a monastic tradition, the Benedictine, with which they were more familiar. So it is important to remember that all these Benedictine houses that I showed you a few moments ago are dependencies. They are not, like Shrewsbury, independent Benedictine houses. They have close ties with larger abbeys, either in England or Normandy. Now, archaeological and material sources can also provide evidence of the transformation of early medieval religious establishments. In relation to Benedictine houses, we might cite Iweni. Here, the survival of pre-conquest stones is suggestive of a site of deep significance, and that this was deliberately chosen for the priory that was founded as a daughter house of Gloucester by the incoming de Landres family. In the early years, as you see from this slide, it was simply a cell of Gloucester, but grew into a conventual priory. And by that phrase, conventual priory, we mean one that was large enough for the sustenance of the full monastic liturgical round. We may suggest then that the intentions of some monastic founders seems not to have been to select new locations for monasteries, but to tap into existing landscapes and to conserve at the same time as appropriating and adapting. Now, historians such as David Knowles, the author of the magisterial work, The Monastic Order in England, and the 3 volumes, The Religious Orders in England, David Knowles had no time for small monastic houses of any persuasion. He dismissed them as mere byproducts of conquest, of little or no spiritual significance. Now, this seems to me to be rather an anachronistic interpretation by a historian, himself a monk, a Benedictine monk, whose ideas of monastic life were influenced by his experience of the full liturgical round in a substantial monastery. And I think it perhaps misses the point that of whatever size these cells or priories were, or whether or not they were perceived to be alien implantations, the grants which sustained them and which renewed or regenerated the monastic landscape were marks of piety on the part of the founders, however we might think of that as conventional. I think we could argue that we may see the process as strategic, as thoughtful and considered, the marks of conquerors who seem to have taken the trouble to discover something of the cultural and spiritual significance of these sites. But there were other factors behind the choice of where to locate monastic houses, more closely tied to the imposition of power and authority. And it's here that I move on to my second point, their proximity to newly constructed castles. And you can see some of them from this chart. First, we have got Chepstow, an early castle, and the earliest Benedictine priory in the southern Welsh March, founded by William Fitzosborne from his family monastery at Cormeilles in Normandy. So I'd just like to look at Chepstow here for a moment, because it's very, very interesting in terms of its topography. The topographical relationship between the castle and the priory church is very interesting. The monastic enclosure seems to have taken up a large space within the walled town, with the church placed not centrally, but to the west. Indeed, the west door, which you can see on the left here, is placed directly opposite the east gate of the castle. Both are heavily decorated, and this suggests an intimate ceremonial or symbolic connection, and I owe that thought to Ron Shoesmith. Oh, we saw some wonderful slides this morning, didn't we, from Trevor of the castle at Chepstow. Just back to this chart for a moment. I won't go through all of them, just note a few common features among these. We've got the presence, again, of pre-existing churches at places like Monmouth and Brecon, and possibly Llandovery. At Iweni, we've got the plantation of the Benedictine priory midway between two castles, Ogmore and Bridgend. And we might note the closeness of the Savignac foundation of Neath to a fortification. At the time of its foundation, round about 1130, by Richard de Granville, the abbey marked the westernmost boundary of the Norman advance into Wales. And at Neath, the location of the abbey was also associated with a proto-urban settlement. And indeed, at Brecon, too, we can see the creation of the tripartite castle priory borough model, which we can see clearly here, just skip through Chepstow again, from Speed's map of Brecon in 1610, which of course is many decades after the dissolution of the priory. But you can see the castle there and various walls. And then to the north, northeast, we have got the church there, the priory church, which retained its function as a parish church, and the dissolved priory there. And I really, really like this map. I like the conjunction, because not only have we got this not quite straight line between the priory and the castle, but coming down here, right under the label here, that is the Dominican friary that was founded in the 13th century. Now, perhaps the most telling indication of the importance of the link between a newly established priory and the castle is formed by the castle chapel. And that intimacy is clear in the foundation of Pembroke. Now, the charter of its founder, Arnulf of Montgomery, tells us that Arnold stood in the very chapter house of his family monastery of Say in Normandy, and there in that solemn presence he granted to the abbey the chapel of St. Nicholas within the castle of Pembroke for the foundation of a priory. And it was here that the monks dwelt until the construction of the priory that you see here. And significantly, one of those monks continued to serve in the castle chapel, and we find this model elsewhere too. And I think this does give us an inkling into the intensely personal relationship that could exist between founder and monastery. Now, it can be argued that the conjunction of castle and monastery was a symbol of colonization, that it was simply a demonstration of the power of a new elite, of the joining of secular and spiritual power. And we really do need to recall what the visual impact of those twin stone structures would have been. But we must also remember that these priories were no less founded with spiritual aspirations, their monks protected by the might of the castles, which they offered while they offered their prayers and their spiritual services. Now, the third significant point that I would make about location, I'll do this very, very briefly because it's been touched on again today. I'll show you this map again. The third significant point is their relationship to lines of communication. Now, anyone who has driven, as William and I have done many times, along the A40 westwards, cannot help being struck by the fact that when you get past Ross-on-Wye, we find the regular appearance of medieval monastic houses 10, 15 or 20 miles apart. So we've got Monmouth, Abergavenny, Brecon, Llandovery, Carmarthen, St. Clears, Haverfordwest, where we have an Augustinian priory later in the 12th century, and Pembroke. Or if we take the more southerly route of communication, wibbling on either side of the M4, we go to Chepstow, Usk, Goldcliff, Bassaleg, Cardiff, etc., etc. Now, the important point I really want just to note here, as that in places these do follow the lines of communication of Roman roads. No fewer than 5 emanated from the area of Brecon. So all these are, have the potential to be linked by Roman roads, and Keith did remind us about the survival and durability of Roman roads. So we've got connections by roads, other houses, no less importantly, connected by rivers or enjoying proximity to sea routes. So again, just think about the density of monastic population here. So taken together, these suggest that the implantation of Benedictine and Cluniac monasticism was driven by a desire for continuity from the early medieval past, by close association with patrons and founders and the centres of their power, and by good communication. In fact, all of these are probably very closely linked. But can we perceive any difference between these Benedictine and Cluniac houses and those of the new orders in terms of their location in the landscape? And I think here particularly of the Cistercians. And if I could just divert from my script for a moment to address the question that was asked earlier. The Cistercians were part of an international monastic order. They spread like a great family tree. We have two waves of Cistercian foundations in Wales. The one that we're concerned with today, the Welsh Cistercian foundations in the March, where we have a number of houses, Tintern, Whitland, Margam and Neath, and one place that figured in Keith's talk this morning in the north, the Abbey of Basingwork, which he was pointing out the location near to Offord. Well, I spotted it anyway. He didn't mention it was a Cistercian house, but it was there near Offers Dyke. So these were spread like a great family tree, and our Cistercian foundations in the Welsh March did indeed have Norman or Anglo-Norman founders, but that's only one part of their identity. They derived ultimately from continental Cistercian houses in France, but not Normandy. So their connections are to Clairvaux in Burgundy, to Le Mone in the case of Tintern, and to Savigny in the case of Neath. But this is what we learn about the Cistercian attitude to the foundation of monasteries. Some of us will be familiar with Cistercian narratives and regulations that talk of the wilderness, or the desert, or places removed from human habitation. These, we read, are the places in which Cistercians should settle. But such pronouncements are, as scholarship is increasingly recognizing, a view from the top down, from the collective governing body of the order, the general chapter, marking an aspiration, perhaps, rather than a blanket requirement. And it's possible to read all this metaphorically. What the Cistercians wanted was a metaphorical desert that could be created even within a settled landscape. That Cistercian sites were not always remote can be explained both by the nature of the landscapes into which the white monks ventured and the desires of their founders and patrons. Despite rhetorical references in Cistercian literature to the desert, or even more dramatically to howling waste, the Cistercians of the Marches and in many other places built within settled landscapes, not outside them. So let's consider some of the evidence. The Cistercian house of Margam was founded in 1147 by Robert Earl of Gloucester. Now, Margam was, in David Robinson's words, and I'm quoting him here, deliberately planted at a location long occupied by a significant pre-conquest ecclesiastical establishment, witnessed by an important group of surviving early Christian memorial stones. Well, here you see the famous 13th century polygonal chapter house and one of those Margam stones from the nearby museum. So this is not so different, is it, from some of those early medieval sites where the Cistercians now seem to be attracted by sites of existing spiritual association. So Margam, this suggests, was probably a place of deep sacred significance. Another perspective is furnished by Whitland, which moved to a second site closely associated with the 10th century Welsh ruler Hywel Dda. Tintern lay just a few miles from the Clare Castle at Chepstow. Not as intimately connected, perhaps, as were the priories of Pembroke, Chepstow or Brecon to their castles, but still in close enough proximity for the monks of Tintern to call on their patrons for protection if needed, and it sometimes was. Well, if some Cistercians settled in locations with existing sacred associations or rooted in Welsh tradition or historical identity, others more closely hugged the English-Welsh border. And we may ask what commended these particular sites to the Cistercians, or perhaps to their founders. Might they have been chosen as deliberate markers of authority within a border or contested region? Well, Abbey-Dore, in the centre of this slide, was founded by Robert FitzHarold, Lord of Uias, which lies just a short distance from Dore. Here you can see the castle, which you've already seen this morning, and the church, which was granted by Robert's father Harold to Gloucester Abbey nearly half a century earlier. Now, Dore was on the very border between England and Wales, and also on the border between the medieval dioceses of Hereford and St. David's, so it looked both east and west. Another Cistercian border site was Grace-Dieu, probably the most troubled of all Welsh Cistercian houses. In 1217, John of Monmouth asked permission of the General Chapter to establish a house on the borders of southeast Wales, which was an area prone to unrest. And the General Chapter, having heard his petition, appointed what it termed discreet men, probably neighbouring abbots, to inspect the site he had offered. And this had become by this time standard Cistercian practice. You couldn't just found a Cistercian house anywhere you wanted. The chapter would appoint visitors to check on the suitability of the site and the adequacy of the endowment that had been offered. So this is the site to which these discreet men bowled up at some point around 1217. But negotiations were protracted, and it was over a decade before the project was realized. Even then, troubles persisted, and John's possession of the site he had given was long disputed by the Welsh. In 1234, the Cistercian General Chapter delegated the abbots of Brepols and Kingswood to persuade the translating here, to persuade the founder either to make peace with his enemies or give the monks a more suitable place where they could live without danger. So why choose this spot, this place, within a disputed landscape in the first place? Was John trying to impose his authority on a contested spot, trying to lay down on his territory an institution that he thought would not easily be shifted? And that actually is a feature of some Cistercian foundations elsewhere. Put an abbey on a disputed spot, and somebody might just think twice before trying to shift it. Or did John perhaps hope that the Cistercians would bring peace to a troubled frontier region? That also is not unknown. Whatever the answer, Grace-Dieu seems to have suffered from its border location all its life. But given the care evident in Cistercian regulations that was paid to the selection of Cistercian sites, it's hard to think that such a location was accidental. Now, just one more slide to illustrate how the desert of the Cistercian landscape was relative comes from the fact that as good Benedictines, they were obliged to offer hospitality. And Cistercian abbeys were again, like the Benedictines, located on routes, often located on routes that made them accessible. What you can see here is a little snippet from Gerald of Wales, who praises Margam Abbey for its hospitality, and records that it was particularly generous in his own time, when in a time of famine, it sent a boat to Bristol to purchase corn to feed the poor who gathered at the abbey gate. In 1336, the monks complained that their location, which they claimed was far from other places of refuge, meant that it was overrun with visitors, rich and poor. A similar complaint was made by Neath in 1289, that there were public ways passing near the abbey and that hospitality was burdensome. So perhaps the Cistercians not quite as distinctive in their locations within the landscape as we might think. But it's now time to turn to the next part of my lecture, and that was, rest assured, that was the longest part of this paper, so don't think you're still going to be here 4 o'clock. Okay, so it's now time to turn to this next part of my paper and to ask what impact monastic houses of the March had on the development of their own landscapes. And we may fruitfully begin thinking about, I think, the impact on the immediate environment. Now, when we visit a ruined abbey or priory, our perception of how it fitted into its landscape is often distorted by what remains, or perhaps what doesn't remain. What may remain is the church, perhaps the offices around the cloister, and if we're lucky, a gatehouse, an infirmary, or an abbatial dwelling. But the actual and visual impact would have been much greater. And I'll just illustrate this by reference to two slides of Tintern Abbey. So what we've got there is the church there, which is taken from the east. We've got the buildings around the cloister, unusually here set on the north side of the church, not the south. We've got the infirmary, the abbot's house here, but less easy to see are the remains of the buildings that would have been to the west of the church, the gatehouse and the guest house. Now, my next slide is taken from David Williams's Atlas of Cistercian Lands in Wales, and it's based on an 18th century estate plan of the manor of Pwrcaseg. And I think it clearly shows the richness of the immediate environment of the abbey. So that's what we were looking at a minute ago. See how tiny it is in proportion to the whole precinct. We see the weirs on the River Wye and the Watergate and ferry linking the abbey to the Grange of Wollaston. The Stank, the pool to the west of the bridge, the guest house by the gatehouse. We may note the paths converging on the abbey and the cobbled way constructed to lead to the Grange of Pwrcaseg and onward to another Grange, that of Rogiston. Two names, Ridding Green and Ridding Grange, derive from a word for asarted or cleared land, here probably relating to cleared woodland. And from other evidence, we know that there was a brew house, a bakehouse, stables, laundry, pantry, a bark loft for storing bark for tanning, as well as water and fulling mills. So the medieval monastery was far more than a church and a set of domestic buildings. It could be an agricultural and industrial complex, which both defined and was defined by its immediate landscape. And here I think it's important to note that this is the kind of pattern we might expect in the larger monasteries. Some of the smaller monasteries that we looked at earlier, and I'll just show you here again to remind you of Llangia, would perhaps have looked little different from a parish church, and the accommodation for a handful of monks would not have been on the cloistral pattern. So a great range here of experience. Now let's move on now to my third and final point, which I will cover briefly, and that is to take a wider perspective on the impact of monastic houses through the economic development of their estates. Now, the extent of monastic influence on the development of the landscape would have varied in part in relation to the extent and nature of lands that were given. Moreover, some particular of our smaller houses depended more on income from the parish churches they were granted than they did on their landed estates. It's therefore the larger and better endowed monasteries that are both the best documented and most likely to have left their traces on the landscape. And it's perhaps to the Cistercians that we should turn, given their reputation for large-scale farming, and to paraphrase Gerald of Wales, for turning the wilderness into a smiling plenty. That was before he fell out with the Cistercians. Okay, so his early years, he was quite in favour of them, but they had a bit of a falling out. Now, the two brief quotations that you see here sum up two traditional views of the Cistercians. On the one hand, scholarship has seen them as pioneers, frontiersmen, who planted themselves on the edges of society and cleared lands for cultivation, pushing forward the boundaries of cultivable land and thereby transforming the landscape. And this is the view that Gerald expresses here. Others have seen them as transformative in another way, in the ruthless clearing of lands and shifting of rural populations. And that's Walter Mapp's succinct comment. Now, we have got evidence in the Welsh March for the clearance of land, signalled by the use of words such as assart or assarting or the creation of riddings, all denoting land cleared for cultivation, either through the felling of wood or through drainage of marsh and fen. Now, we can find plenty of evidence of this. We've already noted it at Tintern, but I'll just give you one more example at Neath. When Richard de Granville founded Neath, his endowment largely comprised wasteland. And you can see the details on this slide. He granted all the wasteland that lies between the waters of Neath, Tawe, Clydach and Pwllcynnan, which may have consisted of up to 25 square kilometres of land. And we've also got reference here to a grant that led to the creation of Cwrt Sart, again suggesting the creation of land from waste. In 1213, another abbey, Abbey Dor, was assarting in the royal forest of Treville, and Gerald of Wales devoted a whole chapter as to how the monks of Dor acted illegally in encroaching on woodland, and he said turned an oak wood into a wheat field. I just thought you might like this slide. It's a manuscript deriving from Cito itself from the mid-1120s. I've called it Cistercian forest clearance, but I'm sure if you can see the slide, you can note the little Cistercian joke in here. But on the whole, clearance of land and depopulation seems to have been undertaken on a relatively small scale. What is much more discernible among the Cistercians of the March is the transformation of scattered estates into consolidated granges, creating large farms and sustainable agriculture, worked in the early years at least through direct farming by conversi and hired labour. And for those of you who are not as familiar with those phrases, grange is a word that is frequently used in relation to Cistercian farming, relating to a farm at the centre of a consolidated block of land. These are the conversi, laymen who entered the monastery, took vows, but were not monks. They were the workers of the monastery, and they were often to be found working on the granges. And in the last 3 minutes, Philip, okay? Right. Just want to give you a few examples of the way in which the Cistercians transformed the March. How they brought change to the landscape and the way in which it was exploited, bringing together parcels of land through securing grants, by purchase, by exchange, by enclosure, by intensive agriculture or industrial activity, by building, by manipulating and exploiting watercourses. Now, Dor Abbey, although in England, had extensive lands in Wales and the Marcher Lordship of Brecon. In one area of expansion, the Golden Valley, it established up to 9 granges through purchase and exchange, and 6 of these lay in an unbroken block of territory from Dor to the Wye. A second area was northern Monmouthshire, where it created 4 grange centres, the most important of which appears to have been Llanfair Kilcoed. The third area lay beyond the Black Mountains at Trawscoed, where Dor tried, ultimately failed, to establish a daughter house, reducing it instead to a grange to lie alongside 2 others, Gwenddŵr and Llan Eglwys. Now we've record here of a sarting, that is clearing lands, milling. Dor had 2 corn mills and 1 fulling mill for producing cloth, and the harvesting of timber for repairing and hedging at their grange building. The major activity, however, was the keeping of sheep for the production of wool. So I think I'll just skip through now just to one more, because this is my last slide. And this is Monknash Grange of Neath Abbey, which David Williams described as the most outstanding grange site in Wales, comprehending some 840 acres, of which 20 acres were delineated by a pentagonal enclosure. There was a large granary, 64.5 metres in length, and a dovecot, which you might be able to spot here. There's a Grange chapel, 3 mills, and actually a couple of holy wells as well. Now, Monkgrash was predominantly an arable grange, but the consolidation of Cistercian lands into extensive estates allowed pastoral farming on a large scale and enabled the white monks to establish a reputation as successful sheep farmers. From the 13th century, they were exporting to Flanders and later still to Italy. They were innovators. This was made possible by the large scale of their operations, innovators in the grading of wool, separating that of good from that of lesser quality. By the 1080s, Neath headed the list of wool producers in both England and Wales, who were selling to a Flemish merchant. And a few decades later, the fleeces of both Tintern and Dor were of the highest quality. So we've got arable, we've got sheep farming, we have got coal mining, we have got iron working in the Forest of Dean by the monks of Tintern. We also have the transformation of the landscape through drainage, the construction of ditches and embankments and enclosures and roads and paths. And on that note, I will finish by thanking you all for listening. And I hope that I've been able to demonstrate some of the ways in which monastic foundations were so important in the creation and the transformation of the landscape of the Southern March of Wales. So, diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you, Janet. That was very informative, and it must have been such a transformation as well of the land that the people previously had been used to. So we have a few minutes for questions. Any takers? We have one already. Can't really hear.
No, I'm afraid I can't hear from up here.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
I have 2 questions.
Right.
One is, do you have any evidence of the ethnicity of the monks in these monasteries, particularly the priories? Are they parachuted in from England or France, or are they recruited locally? The second question is, you talk about the monastic setup, but is there any evidence that the episcopal control moved further westward? Specifically, did the diocese of Hereford and Lichfield move further westwards to reflect the movement of religious life in that direction?
Oh, thank you very much. They're both really, really important questions. The small priories are not the best documented of all monastic houses, but from what we can see, they continue to be a French or Norman presence within the Welsh or Marcher landscape, where we've got reference to priors. They are quite clearly sent from the mother house in France. That's not to say that there couldn't be some local recruitment, but they continue to have this character of being non-Welsh or non-Marcher. So, in terms of recruitment of Welsh Cistercians, again, there's this big divide between the Welsh houses in the March and the Welsh houses of Pura. But we do have both Norman and Welsh names, although it's somewhere like Margam, where we find Welsh names, they tend to be conversi rather than monks. So there is, but one of those abbeys that's always intrigued me is Stratamarcella. Okay, you know where it is, Welshpool. So it's a time of foundation, it is a Welsh foundation. So it is Pura, and yet the monks could have stood in Stratamarcella and waved at people across the river in England. It's that close. And yet there was an incident, it passed into the Charlton patronage when the barony passed to the Charlton family in the late 13th, early 14th century. And there's an incident in about the 1320s, 1340s, when John de Charlton tries to expel the Welsh monks and replace them by English. So I think that's a very interesting piece of evidence from the 14th century. Now, the bishops, you're going to have to stop me from going on here, because this is a really, really interesting question. One of the things that I've got really interested in recently is the question of appropriated churches. And these were churches that were granted to monasteries. The initial grant would have just conveyed the right of patronage, but what frequently happened is that a monastery took over, they appropriated the house with the license of the local bishop. They took all the revenues of the church in return for provision of spiritual services. And Brecon Priory had 12 churches, 8 of them appropriated, and some of those lay in the vicinity of the abbey, of the priory, like Llangors, but a number of them were in Herefordshire. So I think this is what I meant when I talked about in my little synopsis, which I didn't follow up on, it has to be said, about the sort of creation of what I call metaphorical landscapes, and the creation of a group of parish churches tied to a particular religious house. It creates its own, has the potential to create its own dynamic and its own network and its own sacred landscape. And I think what we're seeing here is Hereford sort of being somehow drawn into the influence of Brecon, which is pushing it further west. So we have got the extension of the influence of the bishops of Hereford, notably, but also in Lichfield, through their intervention, through their relationships with religious houses on the march, which does tend to sort of push that authority westwards. So I hope that that's answered your question a little bit. Okay.
Anybody else? Question for John.
Right, there's a question on the Zoom chat.
Oh, Philip, there's somebody here.
Right, I've got to the top now. So.
Beg your pardon.
Right. Okay, so this is a question, Janet. For the Abbey Come Here landscape project, we are exploring the potential impact of the 2 distinct phases of the medieval climate anomaly, warming then cooling, on the economic activity of the Cistercian abbeys. Is this an area in which you have carried out any research?
I can quickly answer that and say no. But it's a very, very good question. The problem of giving a talk like this is that I'm aware that I'm covering institutions that were in existence for over 400 years, or nearly 400 years, in some cases over 400 years. And those are times of great change. So when I'm talking about granges and conversi, that really is a snapshot of the 12th century, and perhaps into the 13th, when we think we know, there's a lot we don't know, but we think we know that the class of conversi was quite buoyant, so that some Cistercian abbeys would have, perhaps if they had 100 monks, they would have 300 conversi. That's the kind of proportion. It's a kind of 3 to 1. Now that enables you to run your estates on the kind of model that I was describing. Now, there are changes. In the 13th century, for various reasons, climate change is one of them. Okay? Economic depression might be another. The class of conversi begins to dwindle. So if you haven't got a workforce that can work your lands by direct farming, you might be forced onto what the Cistercians didn't really want to do to begin with, and that is leasing out their lands. So the Cistercian economic model only lasts as long as economic circumstances don't change. And we get the change with the fall off of recruitment from the conversi in the 13th century. We get the Black Death, in which some cases, I could quote you one abbey in Yorkshire, where the monastic population reduces to 20% of what it had been at pre-plague levels, and there wasn't a single lay brother left. And then there are all the various changes that take place in the later Middle Ages. So it's a variable model. So I think what you're doing is in exploring how these changes of a different type impact is really going to be very, very fruitful. And I look forward to, to reading about it and to talking to my friends at Abbey Come Here about it. Is that okay? I can't say yes, but...
Thank you. I was thinking about the earliest wave of the Benedictine and Cluniac foundations and how they seem to have been targeting existing early medieval sites. So presumably monastic foundations, but also sites with perhaps a pastoral role. And that if you're coming in and you're replacing those with the newer foundations, did they still continue to have a pastoral role? And how, when you're doing that, you're removing, as an incoming sort of, the Normans consolidating their position, you're removing a potential focus of dissent by taking away the place where people used to worship, where perhaps dissent could have sort of formulated, and perhaps it's even more strategic and perhaps cynical than it first looks.
Yes, again, it's a really, really good question. And what we're here doing, I think, is looking at, the fact that they do take over these places, and then trying desperately to find evidence of the impact that that would have had. Now, the reason that Knowles didn't like them at all, these small places, is that he would have said, what you're saying, look, this is all about economy, this is all about income, this is about a Norman conqueror coming along, giving this church and a few lands to his abbey in Normandy, or her abbey in Normandy, popping a couple of monks in there to really act as managers and administrators. And there is a point there. I guess I tend to try and look at it in another way, because I'm a champion of all things small, right? So small religious houses have been far too often just dismissed as being of no significance. And I try to think about it, and I think, well, if I was a founder and I give these endowments, I'm giving it to this big abbey, but I'm still performing an act that is spiritual. It is making a grant, and that's part of the medieval mentality, is that you do, by these good works, by sustaining people. And there's no reason to suppose that these 2 or 3 monks at Llangyr or Kidwelly or whatever, they're not just sort of managing all day. They'll be saying the offices, they will be praying for the souls of their founders, and they will be engaging with maybe a reduced liturgy, so that I don't want to remove that religious or spiritual aspect completely. So, but again, it's like so many things, isn't it? It's a kind of mix and match. It's some bit of one, a bit of this, bit of the other. And but what would be very interesting to know, in some cases this did happen, if places continued to have some kind of parochial function, because sometimes they did. Certainly Brecon, which wasn't one of these small cells, it was a substantial priory, but continued to be used in a parochial sense. And, you know, if you read Gerald of Wales on the what happens on the Feast of St. Eluned, you know, it is obviously a centre of popular religion, we might call it, as well as parish worship. But thank you very much for your question. That's a really interesting one. I hope the answer was as interesting as the question.
Okay, thank you very much again, Janet. Thank you. That was really interesting.